It's 2 years since the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, but black men are still being killed at an alarming rate by police officers in the United States. Floyd's murder brought millions onto the streets and propelled the Black Lives Matter movement into the public eye. But is enthusiasm for the movement and the cause fading? Welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Good to have you with us. The video of the murder of George Floyd was shared by millions of people worldwide, sparking an outpouring of outrage and calls for police reform. While the police officer who killed Floyd was found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, activists called for measures to defund the police. President Joe Biden dismissed the call and promised police reforms to reduce deaths. He told the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People back in 2020, "Watch what I do. Judge me based on what I do, what I say, and to whom I say it." The city of Minneapolis paid $27 million to the Floyd family to settle a wrongful death lawsuit. The Washington Post found that 25 police and sheriff's departments had paid out more than $3 billion over the past 10 years for citizens wrongly injured or killed by the police. So is the Black Lives Matter movement the right movement to help end police brutality, and is there genuine political will to do so? Well, joining us now from New Jersey, Douglas Flowe, Associate Professor of African American History at Washington University in St. Louis. In Cardiff, in the UK, we have Gus John, Honorary Fellow and Associate Professor at the Institute of Education and the University of London, and a human rights campaigner. Joining us from Minneapolis in Minnesota, civil rights attorney Nekima Levy Armstrong. Good to have you all with us. So, Nekima Levy Armstrong, if I could start with you then, how would you assess the state of race relations in the U.S. 2 years on from the murder of George Floyd?
I think that the state of race relations in the U.S. is largely the same as it was before George Floyd was killed. I think the difference is that there is a greater level of awareness amongst folks around the country about the history of police, as well as some of the brutality that continues to exist. Some jurisdictions have changed their laws and policies on the books, but not enough has been done to address the systemic racism within the system of policing and across many of our institutions in the United States that continue to perpetuate racism, white supremacy, and oppression.
Okay, we want to put up a graphic now that addresses some of this. According to the Mapping Police Violence organization, 266 black men were killed in 2021 and 39 so far this year. Here's just a sample of them. April 2022, Michigan, Patrick Loyoya. April 2021, in Minnesota, Dante Demetrius Wright. In October 2020, in Texas, Jonathan Dwayne Price. In March 2020, in Kentucky, Breonna Taylor. This is just a few of the many black people who have died at the hands of police in the United States. And this speaks to some of what you have just been saying there, Nekima Levy Armstrong, about the fact that very little has changed in that regard when you look at the statistics. But I just want to pick up on what you were saying about the increased awareness of what black people face in the U.S. on a daily basis, and how can we take that as is that a positive that we can take moving forward?
I think that we can take that as a positive. I mean, we saw a worldwide uprising, unlike anything that has happened in the history of this nation or in the world. Folks not only around the country, but across the globe were standing in solidarity, demanding justice for George Floyd, but also pushing for changes within their local jurisdictions. That's something that we can take away from what happened in the time since George Floyd was killed. But I think that it's going to take a sense of steadfastness and determination if we are going to root out racism and white supremacy within the system of policing and across various systems and institutions. Too much has happened that scratches the surface, and not enough has been done that addresses the deep rooted issues that our country has always grappled with when it comes to race.
All right, then, Douglas Flowe, what's your take on that? Is there a need to really get to the root causes of this? And has any of that conversation happened over the last 2 years?
Yeah, well, this is a great question, and this is something I spend an entire semester with my students talking about. This is a really long historical issue. Most of my work is about looking at how this issue goes all the way back to the end of the 19th century. And so, yeah, today, in order to handle this problem, we really do need some deep, systemic change. It's true that a lot of the conversation is happening. It's true that there are some ways in which an understanding of racialized policing has become a mainstream thing, where people generally, especially those who are willing to accept the possibility, people generally kind of understand that there are issues when it comes to race and policing. But we've also seen that the attempts at federal police reform have failed. We've seen some local law enforcement agencies reforming themselves to some extent, like what we've seen in Colorado with the body camera bill. We've seen that New York City has worked to eliminate some of the issues surrounding qualified immunity for police officers. But the federal reform has just not happened. So that is something that we really need to do.
Why do you think that is? Is it because there isn't a political will there?
Well, I think there are a couple of issues, and two of the things that are really coming up right now as Biden's administration has been attempting to deal with this is, one, during the COVID lockdowns, we've had some serious and very visible increases in crime, right? I mean, there have been a number of places across the country where crime has increased very empirically. And then also at the same time, there's a lot of just political grappling and fighting about what sort of police reform should actually happen. I mean, we think about, for instance, the subject of qualified immunity, which is, it's a legal doctrine that comes from the Supreme Court saying that state employees, and in this case, particularly police officers, should be protected from certain types of litigation when they're accused of excessive force, et cetera. Republicans don't really want to do anything about that, and Democrats want to. And when it comes down to those sorts of issues, how do we actually reform the police? It's been very difficult for anything to move through the federal government and actually come to fruition.
Gus John, the killing of George Floyd and the protests that followed throughout the United States is, of course, something that resonated with people way beyond the United States. So we saw protests here in the UK, in Western Europe, and throughout the world. What do you think that has been the effect of all of that, particularly in the UK where you are?
I think it's concentrated the local population on the extent to which these killings had been going on for some while by police of Black people in Britain without the society sitting up and taking very much notice. Most institutions in the country, including universities, behave as if they'd had some kind of an epiphany as a result of George Floyd's murder. But the fact of the matter is that ever since 1969, we've had a whole string of murders year after year of Black people by the police, which have basically gone virtually unnoticed. The only people complaining and campaigning against them are we as Black people ourselves. I'm talking about deaths in custody. I'm talking about deaths at the hands of the border force as they seek to deport people from the country, violent restraint and all of that stuff. And that's not to mention the number of instances where neo-fascists have killed Black people and the police haven't really pursued them vigorously.
Yeah, we'll expand on this a little bit more, this how racism is a global issue. We're going to put up a graphic now because it's not, as we said, not just the US where racism is a problem, of course. It's been highlighted by Africans facing discrimination at the Ukraine border. We heard all those stories, unable to pass following the Ukraine conflict, those initial days. Media bias in coverage of the conflict in Ukraine, more sympathy towards white Ukrainian refugees in comparison to black, Asian, and Arab conflicts and refugees. In 2021, in France, nearly 12,500 racist crimes were reported, and most victims were African males. In one of the most high-profile cases, a music producer was beaten by police there. And here in the UK, a boy aged 11 who was called the N-word before an attack that left him needing a finger amputated. So if I come back to you then, Gus John, on this, specifically in the UK, do you think that this is kind of this whole awareness of racism in the UK? Do you think it's fizzled out a bit over the last 2 years, that it's lost the public's attention because of everything else that's been going on in the world right now with the pandemic and with the war in Ukraine?
Well, I don't think it has, because in the last period, including today, there were reports of police violations, particularly of black women. You would know the case of the child called Child Q at a school in London, who was strip searched while she was menstruating, and in the presence of male officers without teachers being present. Just recently, there's been another case of a 14-year-old autistic child who was strip searched by the police. She had her knickers cut away from her, and she was examined intimately by male police officers in that police station. So there have been incidents which lead me to say one thing, which is this, that the Black Lives Matter movement needs to be concentrating on those as much as on deaths at the hands of the police. Because Black lives matter not only when people are dead, we would prefer them to stay alive. And consequently, there needs to be some concerted action in relation to those violations by the police routinely, so that we are holding them and the government to account.
All right, let's put some of that to Nekima Levy Armstrong, that it isn't just an issue of the number of black people who have died at the hands of police and the authorities. It's an issue of just general respect for the lives of black people.
I do agree that we need to look generally at the lives of black folks and how these systems are treating and mistreating us. But I'm not sure that I agree that that's the responsibility solely of Black Lives Matter. As someone who has been on the front lines as a volunteer, at times working very collaboratively with Black Lives Matter, our local chapters here, it's such a heavy lift just to even bring attention to a killing at the hands of the police. There are so many layers and layers of advocacy that are necessary in order to get the attention of elected officials, in order to get the attention of the general population, and to get them to care and to stand up and to advocate for justice. And most of these individuals who are part of the Black Lives Matter movement are volunteers. So these are folks who work like everyone else, but who take on such a huge burden that has impacted this country for so many years. And many of the folks are young people who aren't living their lives the way that young people should, but who are out on the front lines, putting their bodies on the line to stand up for justice. So I think that, given how big this country is, given how large the world is, there are more than enough individuals who can take on some of the additional issues that have been referenced by my fellow co-panelists. And the reality is that it does take different skill sets to advocate when you're pushing for changes within the prison system, looking at conditions of confinement and some of the systemic barriers that incarcerated people face. That's a different skill set than the advocacy that it takes to raise awareness and to push for justice for those who have been killed by the police. One other thing I'll share is that, when we look at the conviction of Derek Chauvin, the officer who put his knee on George Floyd's neck for, over 9 minutes, folks would think that just by that video, that should have been enough for Derek Chauvin to be convicted, and yet it wasn't. In Minneapolis, we literally had to take to the streets to demand the firing of all 4 officers, to demand that the case be removed from the hands of the county attorney and placed into the hands of the attorney general. We had to push for stronger charges. And then you all saw Minneapolis was literally set on fire as a result of people's outrage and the government's slow response to the concerns after George Floyd was killed. Those are issues people are still suffering from. And injuries people face at the hands of police, whether it's tear gas or projectiles, people lost eyes, people had to have major surgeries. And so again, that is in my opinion, it's a different skill set. And one group of volunteers comprising mostly of young folks shouldn't have to bear the burden of addressing these long-standing systemic challenges across various systems, including policing.
Douglas Flowe, if I could ask you about this, there's no question that social media has played a big role in all of this in terms of raising awareness about racism and mistreatment at the hands of the police. The way many of these videos have spread on Twitter and Facebook and so on. But is there a danger that people become kind of desensitized to all of this and that their attention eventually shifts to something else?
Yeah, there's always that danger. We in America, we have a history of violence. We have a present that is racked by violence. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had this shooting in Buffalo, which really kind of opens up a lot of conversations about race, about replacement theory, about white supremacy. It was on the news for a few days, and then it goes away. It slips out of the news cycle. I mean, so this is something that happens in social media, and it's something that has been happening in our news cycles for a very long time. And so the question is, how do we make these sorts of things sustainable? One of the things that was really unique about the murder of George Floyd last year, as tragic as it was, it thrust police violence into all of our consciousness, and it remained as a part of our conversations on social media and in the news cycle for quite a while. And then obviously we've seen we're 2 years, it's 2 years later, and it's not as present as we would like it to be. It's not as present in people's minds. It's not as present in our legislation. It's not as present in our news cycle. And so there's always that danger. I think that one of the things that's really important, as my fellow panelists have been saying, is that we keep pushing and making sure that these things remain in people's consciousness. And I was going to add to the previous question just to say that, one of the really important things is that we deal with the issue of incarceration. Thinking about African Americans who are still alive and how important it is to advocate before people are killed. There are thousands upon thousands of people in prison, some of which are there unfairly, unjustly, and many of whom are experiencing all different types of violence and deprivation. And part of the whole idea of critical race theory, which gets a really, really bad name in the press now, is part of the idea is to really kind of humanize and understand the racial components that are baked into every aspect of our legal system. Dealing with the issue of incarceration, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and the fallout from that, the things that people deal with while they're in prison, the things that get them into prison in the first place, and the ways in which their lives are hobbled, legally hobbled to a large extent after they leave prison is very important. And so these sorts of things, we talk about them and they enter the news cycle and they leave, as you were saying. So we really do need to find ways to make them more sustainably a part of our everyday conversations and our mainstream thought.
And there's no doubt that the Black Lives organization, in terms of the amount of funding it gets because of the attention brought on by the case of George Floyd, has grown quite a bit over the last 2 years. We're going to talk a little bit more about that right now. There's been criticism of the Black Lives Matter Foundation and its funding, whether the charity is misusing funds or is it a charity that is still learning. It raised $90 million in donations, that's according to the Associated Press, $6 million on a Los Angeles compound, and $840,000 to a security firm run by the brother of co-founder Patrisse Cullors. It's no surprise that with organizations like this, there's always going to be a scrutiny of a new organization and how it gets its funding and so on. But I want to put this to you, Nekima, Levy, Armstrong, whether this is all kind of much ado about nothing, or is this something that people should be concerned about?
Well, I can't speak for the folks who run the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation, which is not the same as the local chapters, some of which are not necessarily connected to the Global Foundation. But what I will say is that I feel that the organization is facing a lot more scrutiny because it is a Black-led organization that is focused on disrupting the status quo when it comes to police officers being able to kill people. No one is asking to open up the books of the Red Cross or looking at the properties that entity has, or many other organizations that have been around for many, many years that are able to buy multi-million-dollar properties and buildings and collect tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions in donations. And we don't know where those resources go. We don't know how many people are helped, and no one is asking those questions. So why, when it comes to an organization that has helped bring about the largest movement around racial justice since the civil rights movement, is facing this kind of scrutiny? I don't think that it's a coincidence. If anything, we should be looking at all of the organizations that collect money on behalf of Black folks on the backs of the poor, who hand out fish all day, who don't teach people how to fish, and we see the conditions remaining the same in our community. So I do think that it's unfair to point the finger at one organization, but I do hope at the same time that the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation will share more information with the public about the resources, the use of resources. I haven't seen anything tangible that shows that that they have done anything unlawful. But I think that people are asking for more transparency, which I think is fair. But at the same time, we need to look at this level of scrutiny in the context of the inordinate number of white-led organizations that receive lots of funding. They're able to move about freely, purchase property, and no one bats an eyelid. That's a problem for me.
All right. Douglas Flowe, what is the solution to this then? Is it defunding the police? Is that the right way to go forward? Because there are those who will say that that's a kind of a turnoff for a lot of people. People need the police. People need law enforcement in their communities. They need some form of law and order, and it's far better to try to change the system from within. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I don't think defunding the police is really the way to do it. I don't think that's what most people mean when they say defund the police. It's more about reform the police. As you said, there's always going to be some sort of policing system, whether you call it public safety or not. Whatever you call it, there's always going to be some sort of system of policing. And I think that what really needs to happen is we can continue to do the local reforms that we've been doing, many of which have been great, which I mentioned earlier. But there does need to be some federal reform. There needs to be some sort of blanket federal reform, and that includes possibly forcing police officers to wear body cameras, definitely dismantling qualified immunity, which very often allows police officers to feel free to act in certain ways that may be violent, that may violate the human rights of the people in their custody, and to recognize that they most likely won't have to deal with any sort of civil litigation, much less any sort of conviction. We also need to deal with the blue wall of silence. Police officers very often are able to solve crimes and solve homicides by asking people in the community to speak up about what they've seen and what they've experienced, and police officers need to do the same thing. We also need to outlaw certain types of holds. There's no reason in the world why Derek Chauvin should have done what he did. There's no reason in the world why that should have been legal at the time. There's no reason in the world why so many other African Americans and other people are experiencing the sorts of violence and the violent holds that sometimes can stop someone from breathing. So that sort of thing needs to be outlawed. It needs to be regulated. We also need to disallow no-knock warrants. Which was a sort of invasion of privacy that killed Breonna Taylor. So there are a number of actual things we can do to reform policing, but there's a whole lot more than that. Part of the reason why they are changing the name of their police department in Minneapolis to public safety is because they want it to be less about policing and more about a kaleidoscope of other types of functions that police can serve, that can help people, that can deal with problems before they might graduate to the level of violence, deal with mental health issues, deal with issues of poverty, connect with the community, right? So there can be reforms that can actually make policing a lot safer, a lot better, and it doesn't stop there. This is something that we'll always need to continue to change, and we'll have to work on it.
That's going to have to be the last word. We've got to leave it there. Thank you very much to all three of you, Douglas, Flowe, Gus John, and Nekima, Levy, Armstrong. Thanks very much for being with us. And remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But from now, from me and all the team here, goodbye, and thanks for watching.